In the last section, we started working on our post new component by importing two helpers from Redux form. The first was the field component, which we are using to specify an input inside of this component. Because our form that we're putting together has three different properties or three different inputs that we want to reflect on here, I'm going to eventually expect to see three separate field components inside this component. So the first one that we added right here will be responsible for recording the title that the user wants to enter for this new blog post. The second thing that we imported from Redux form was the Redux form function helper. So we treat this thing very much like the connect helper from the React Redux library. We use the Redux form helper to wrap the post new component. By doing so, we gave Redux form the ability to communicate directly from this component to the reducer that we wired up inside the last section as well. One more thing about the form property in here. Remember that the form property is used to specify kind of a namespace of sorts for all the state that is going to be generated by this particular component. The only requirement for the form property right here is that it is unique. And it only needs to be unique if we want this form to essentially live in isolation and not share any of its state with any other forms. Once you start working with like multi-page forms or wizard type forms, that's where the value of this form property right here starts to get a lot more important. So for right now, for basic forms you put together, again, you really just need to put in a unique string right here. Okay, so let's get back to our field component. The field component, one more time, it is used to represent a distinct input that will be visible on the screen to our users. We specified the name property right here, which specifies exactly what piece of state this field is going to produce. We also added on this mysterious prop called component, and that's where we kind of left it off. We didn't talk too much about what it does. So let's talk about what component right here, what this prop is for. Before I flip over to a diagram that's going to help us figure out what's going on here, I want you to take notice that in this configuration for the field that we've put together so far, I have done absolutely nothing to say, hey, this is supposed to be a text input so far, right? Like nothing here says text input, even though I've said that Redux form handles text inputs, checkboxes, blah, 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 all those other type of things. So I want you to just keep that in mind for right now. Okay, so let's flip over to a diagram. Here we go. So the issue with the field component, by default, it knows how to communicate with Redux form, which is very helpful because it saves us having to wire up all those different event handlers and action creators and all that different kind of stuff, right? So great, Redux form is going to help us out with that side of things. And the field component is really key in that equation. The field component knows how to wire up all these event handlers, call action creators, all that great stuff. The shortcoming of the field component, however, is that it does not know how to produce some amount of JSX to show on the screen to our users. So the field component, it doesn't know how to show itself on the screen. It only knows how to interact with Redux form. The purpose of that component property that we're adding in here is to add in a function that will return some amount of JSX that will be used to show that field on the screen. So essentially, you can think of the field component as being kind of an abstract kind of data record keeper. It's kind of like a librarian of sorts, where it just wants to kind of hide away and keep track of a bunch of data. This component prop that we're adding in is the much more visual face. It's the outward facing side. It's the thing that interacts directly with the user. And it's our job to define this component property. We are defining this component property right here because we want to have a lot of control over exactly how the field appears on the screen. We don't really care so much about what Redux form is doing internally, so we delegate all those event handlers and action creators, blah, 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 all that stuff over to the field side. Okay, so with this little discussion in mind, let's start working on this first component prop. So again, the component property is supposed to be a function that returns some amount of JSX. So rather than defining a function in here, I'm not going to define a function just directly in here. I'm going to make a helper function on the component class itself. So I'll say this dot render title field. Now do notice that I am not putting any parentheses in here. We are just providing a reference to a function because the field will call that function at some point in the future. We're not calling it ourselves. So we'll put in render title field like so. Now this is the part where things start to get a little bit confusing. Remember that render title field right here is just supposed to return some amount of JSX. However, we do still have to kind of wire up the JSX that we are adding in here to the field component. To help us do that, render title field is going to be called with an argument that we by convention call field. This field object right here contains some event handlers that we need to wire up to the JSX that we're returning. So I probably just lost you is my expectation. I bet I just lost you. So the first thing we'll do, I'll tell you what, let's delete field right here, and we're gonna write out some JSX inside this function, and I'm gonna ask you a little bit about why you think that this might or might not work. Okay, so let's take the naive approach first. I'm gonna return a div, and this div is going to return an input, okay? And I'm gonna give myself a little bit of space to work with props inside of here. So let's imagine that we just left this as is right now. Let's say that we executed this or we saved the file and we refreshed it inside the browser. Now, everything that I've told you so far has been, yeah, the field component is responsible for event handling and updating our different pieces of state. It's up to us to define the component prop, which will return some amount of JSX that represents the actual element that gets rendered onto the screen, right? Okay, we've covered that. I've repeated that probably 5 times inside this lecture so far. So I want to ask you a question right now. I want you to look at this input right here, and I want to ask you, does the field component have any reasonable reason to somehow say, oh, well, if the user updates this input, any changes to this thing must be corresponding to this particular field? Do you have like any reasonable sense for that? Well, maybe yes, but really no. We can't really have any reasonable suspicion to say that this input right here is just going to be magically tracked by the field component. It's up to us to make sure that this field component recognizes that when it calls render title field, which returns this input right here, the field component needs to be responsible for handling any changes to this input. Okay, it's still on us. There's no real magic here. We still have to wire this thing up. So that's the purpose of the field argument. The field argument contains an event handler or two that is going to be responsible for making sure that this field right here knows that it is responsible for dealing with this very particular text input right here. Now, I know that I've told you several times that Redux form is responsible for handling all these event handlers, and so you might be saying, well, Stephen, wait, you just told me Redux form is responsible for the event handlers, but now you're telling me that we have to wire these things up manually on the input? And the answer is, well, not quite. It's way easier than you'd think. All we have to do is say curly braces, ... field ... input, like so. That's really end of responsibility on our side. So this is a little bit of strange syntax right here. Field.input is an object which contains a bunch of different event handlers and a bunch of different props. So stuff like on change and on blur, on focus. It also has the value of the input. By doing the ... in here, we're saying, okay, this is an object right here, and I want all of the different properties in this object to be communicated as props to the input tag. So it's just a little bit of fancy JSX to kind of save us from having to do something like on change equals field.input.onChange and on change, on focus and on blur. So this is where the real time savings comes from with Redux form. We don't have to wire these things up manually. We just have to pass through all these pre-generated event handlers through. Okay, so I know that we've put a ton of knowledge in here, a lot of talking, a lot of discussion, a lot of very particular things about exactly how Redux form works. I want to put on just one last property to this thing. I want to make sure that the input knows that it's supposed to be showing itself as a text type input as opposed to like a field or excuse me, a file picker or something like that. So I'm just going to specify very deliberately, hey, this is supposed to be a text type input. All right, I think that we're about ready for a test inside the browser, just to at least get a sense of whether or not we're somewhat doing things right. I know that there's still some aspects of Redux Forum that are a little bit, I haven't gone into great detail just yet, even though we've been doing a lot of talking. So I do want to test this thing out, make sure we're going down the right path, and then we'll come back and kind of flesh out this render title field thing a little bit more. So inside my browser, I'll flip on over to our application, localhost 8080. I'm at post.new. I'm going to refresh the page. And we're getting a big error on here right now, which is no problem. Let's come back and figure out exactly what's going wrong with this thing inside the next section.